You had a good day once, maybe even a great one. But right now, sitting here, can you remember it in detail? The sounds, the feeling, the way the light looked? Probably not. Yet somewhere in the sane mind, there is a conversation from years ago. Someone's careless words, a rejection, a moment of quiet humiliation. And it is still there, still vivid, still sharp at the edges. We carry so much of what hurt us, and so little of what healed us. This is not bad memory. This is not weakness. This is something far older than you. Something built into the very architecture of being human. But the question is, why? Why does pain get to stay when joy is always packing its bags? To understand why pain stays, we have to go back. Far back. Not to childhood, not to a single difficult moment, but to a time before cities, before language, before any of this. Imagine one of your earliest ancestors, standing at the edge of a forest. The air is still. The light is low. Two things happened to them that day. In the morning, they found a bush full of ripe fruit. Sweet, easy, good. In the afternoon, something moved in the grass, and they barely escaped with their life. Now, which of those two moments do they need to remember tomorrow? The fruit is gone. But the shape of that movement in the grass, the direction it came from, the sound just before it, that memory could be the difference between surviving and not. This is where it begins, not in sadness, not in trauma, in pure, simple survival. The human brain learned, over hundreds of thousands of years, that painful and threatening experiences deserve more attention, more storage, more clarity. Because forgetting a source of pleasure costs you a good afternoon, but forgetting a source of danger could cost you everything. Neuroscientists have a phrase for this, the negativity bias, and it is not a flaw. It was for most of human history, a feature. When something frightening or painful happens, the brain releases stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, that essentially tell the memory system, record this carefully. The emotional weight of a negative experience acts like a highlighter, marking it for long-term storage. Positive experiences, unless they are intense or repeated, don't always get the same signal. They are processed, acknowledged, and often quietly let go. Think of it like a security camera. It runs all day, but it only saves the footage when it detects something wrong. Your mind does not record your life equally. It was never designed to. And here's something worth sitting with. This is not personal. It is not a reflection of who you are or how sensitive you are. It is not a sign that your life has more darkness than light. It is simply the operating system you were born with. The same one your ancestors ran on, generation after generation, because it worked. It kept them alive. It kept them careful. It kept them moving through a world that was genuinely dangerous in ways we can barely imagine today. A person who remembered every near miss, every bad harvest, every predator's shadow. That person paid attention. That person survived. And that person passed something forward to you, a mind that holds pain close not out of cruelty, but out of an ancient, unspoken loyalty to your own life. The joy you felt last summer, your brain let it drift. Because drifting is safe. The argument that still sits in your chest, your brain kept it sharp, because sharp things protect you. This is where the story starts. Not with sadness, with survival. So the bias was built in. That much we understand now. But here is where it gets more interesting and more personal. Because what started as a simple survival response did not stay simple. Over time, it became something larger, something more organized. The brain did not just react to individual painful moments. It began to build a system around them. Think of it this way. The first time you touch something hot, the pain is a warning. But your brain does not stop there. It takes that single experience and begins to construct a rule. Heat is dangerous. Be careful around heat. Remember this. One moment becomes a pattern. One pattern becomes a filter, and that filter begins to quietly shape how you see the world going forward. Psychologists call this a negativity bias loop. The brain not only stores negative experiences more vividly, it also uses them as reference points for interpreting new ones. So a new situation that feels even slightly similar to an old painful one gets flagged, gets watched, gets remembered. The system is self-reinforcing. The more painful memories you store, the more sensitive your threat detection becomes. And the more sensitive your threat detection becomes, the more likely you are to notice and remember the next difficult thing. Meanwhile, positive experiences move through a different pathway. They are felt, yes. Enjoyed, yes. But unless they are particularly intense, they tend to leave shallower traces. Research suggests that the brain needs a positive experience to last roughly 3 times longer than a negative one for it to register with similar emotional weight. 3 times longer. That is not a small gap, and most of the good things in life are quiet. A warm morning, a meal shared without argument, a conversation that ends with both people feeling understood. These moments are real, but they are gentle. They don't announce themselves, they don't insist on being remembered. So they fade. There is a man, a teacher, middle-aged, who spent 30 years in a classroom he loved. He built real connections with hundreds of students, watched them grow, felt proud in quiet, consistent ways. But when he retired, what stayed with him most vividly was not the gratitude or the growth. It was a single afternoon, decades earlier, when a student mocked him in front of the class. One afternoon. 30 years. And that one afternoon had a sharper outline than almost anything else. He was not ungrateful. He was not broken. His brain was simply doing what brains do, protecting the archive it thought mattered most. This is the system at work. Not dramatic, not visible, just quietly running in the background of every life, deciding what to keep and what to release. What we are left with, over time, is not an accurate record of our lives. It is a curated one, edited by a system that was never trying to make us happy, only trying to keep us safe. And for a long time, that was enough. But the world changed. The world changed. But the system didn't. That is the quiet problem at the center of all of this. The brain that was shaped for a dangerous, unpredictable world. A world where forgetting a threat could end your life, is now living in a very different kind of world. One where most of us are not running from predators. One where the dangers are softer, slower, less visible. A harsh word in a meeting. A relationship that slowly cools. A failure that no one else even noticed. The threats are real, but they are not the same kind of real. And yet the system responds the same way. It flags, it stores, it replays. You already know this feeling. You have replayed a conversation in your head long after it ended. You have lain awake at night, not because of what is happening, but because of what happened. Weeks ago, months ago, sometimes years ago. The brain pulls the memory out, examines it again, looks for something it might have missed, a threat it might have underestimated. This is not weakness. This is the old system doing its job. The problem is, the job no longer fits the world. And here is where the cost becomes personal. Because when a system designed to protect you begins operating in a world it wasn't built for, the protection starts to feel like punishment. The same mechanism that once kept your ancestors alert at the edge of a forest now keeps you small, careful in ways that close doors instead of opening them, hesitant in relationships. Not because the person in front of you is dangerous, but because someone else, long ago, was. A woman meets someone new. Kind, patient, present. Everything feels right. But somewhere beneath that feeling, an older memory is running. A time she trusted someone and it ended badly. Her brain does not know the difference between then and now. It only knows the pattern. And so it whispers, be careful. Remember what happened last time. She pulls back. Not because of who he is, because of what was stored. This is the hidden cost. Not just that we remember pain more than joy, but that the remembered pain begins to shape the future. It becomes a lens. And when you see everything through a lens of past hurt, the present is always slightly distorted. We make smaller choices. We expect less. We brace ourselves even when there is nothing coming. And perhaps most quietly damaging of all, we begin to use our painful memories as evidence. Evidence about who we are. I failed at that, so I am someone who fails. I was left before, so I am someone who gets left. The brain was only trying to build a useful pattern. But patterns, applied to the self, become identity, and an identity built from pain is a very heavy thing to carry. The system was never meant to define you. It was meant to protect you. But somewhere in the long, quiet years of a life, the two things get confused, and we forget because the brain lets us forget. All the mornings that were simply fine, all the kindness that passed through without leaving a mark, all the ordinary joy that came and went without asking to be remembered. It was there. It was always there. The system just didn't think it was worth keeping. You are not alone in this, not even close. One of the most quietly reassuring things about the negativity bias is how completely universal it is. It does not belong to people who had difficult childhoods, or people who carry old wounds, or people who simply tend toward sadness. It belongs to everyone. It is, in the most literal sense, the human condition. Studies have shown that people recall critical feedback far more often than praise, even when the praise was given more frequently. A performance review with 9 positive comments and 1 concern will often be remembered almost entirely for the concern. The 9 good things do not disappear. They simply don't fight for space the way the one difficult thing does. This happens in relationships too. Researchers who study long-term partnerships have found that stable, happy couples tend to maintain a ratio of roughly 5 positive interactions for every 1 negative one, 5 to 1, just to keep the emotional balance steady. Not because the positive moments matter less, but because the negative ones carry more weight by default. The system is always running, even between people who love each other deeply. We see it in how we talk about our days. Someone asks how your day was, and even if 7 hours of it were unremarkable and good, the difficult moment, the frustrating email, the awkward exchange, the small embarrassment is often what rises first to the surface, not because you are pessimistic, because your brain flagged it, stored it clearly, and made it easy to retrieve. A man finishes a long project he is proud of. His team responds well. His manager says something genuinely kind. That evening, he sits with his family and feels not satisfaction, but a low hum of unease. He keeps returning, mentally, to a small mistake buried in the middle of the work, something no one else noticed or mentioned. But he noticed, and his brain kept it. He is not being too hard on himself. He is being human. This normalization matters, not because it makes the bias harmless, but because understanding it changes your relationship with it. When you know why the difficult things feel so much louder than the gentle ones, you stop mistaking the volume for the truth. A mind that replays a painful memory is not telling you that your life is full of pain. It is telling you that an old system is still doing its job. The bias is not a verdict. It is a mechanism. And like any mechanism, once you can see it clearly, you have something you didn't have before. A small but real distance between the noise and yourself, between the memory and the meaning you give it. You can notice the replay without becoming it. You can feel the weight of what the brain kept without deciding that what it released was never real. The good mornings happened. The quiet kindnesses happened. The moments of belonging and warmth and simple peace. They happened. They were just never the ones the system chose to save. So here we are, at the end of the explanation, and perhaps the beginning of something quieter. We now understand, at least in part, why the mind works this way, why pain gets a permanent room while joy is always passing through, why the difficult moments arrive so quickly when we reach for them, and the tender ones feel like trying to hold water in open hands. But understanding a thing and making peace with it are not the same journey, because even knowing all of this, even holding the full picture of the biology, the evolution, the ancient logic of survival, there is still a moment, late at night, when an old hurt surfaces and feels completely current. Feels like now, and no amount of knowing quite dissolves that. Maybe it isn't supposed to. There is a certain philosophy, quiet and easy to miss, hidden inside all of this, and it is this. Perhaps the goal was never to remember joy as sharply as pain. Perhaps the goal is simply to stop confusing what the brain kept with what actually mattered. Memory is not a measure of value. It is a measure of perceived threat. The moments your mind held onto most tightly were not necessarily your most important moments. They were your most alarming ones. The brain archived them because it thought you might need them again. Not because they defined you, not because they were the truest version of your life. The joy was real. The warmth was real. The ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when everything was simply fine, that was real too. The brain let it go because it seemed safe to let go. And safe, in the language of survival, means not dangerous, not urgent, not a threat. But we are more than what threatens us. This is what the old system cannot account for. It was built to keep you alive, not to help you understand what made your life worth living. Those are two different tasks. And for most of human history, only the first one mattered. We are perhaps the first kind of creature in the long story of this planet who has the strange luxury of asking the second question. Not just how do I survive, but what do I want to carry with me? And that question, small and personal as it sounds, is actually enormous, because it means that memory, at least in some part, can become a choice. Not a complete one, not an easy one. The old system will always have more momentum than any conscious intention. But there is a difference between being ruled by what the brain kept and being defined by it. You can know that the painful memory is louder without deciding it is truer. You can understand that joy left quietly without concluding that joy was ever less real. You can hold the shape of an old wound and still choose to look for what the system released. The conversations that ended gently. The ordinary days that asked nothing of you. The people who stayed without making it dramatic. They were there. Perhaps they are still there. Somewhere softer in the mind, not sharp enough to find easily, but present, waiting, without urgency, the way good things so often do. The brain was built for survival. But you are built for more than that, and the quiet work of a life, perhaps, is learning to remember what the system forgot, not perfectly, not all at once, but slowly, with patience, with the same gentle persistence that joy itself has always had. Until next time, my friends, sleep well and stay curious.